There we go.
Now it
There we
says,
go.
there we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. I don't. I Zoom is fairly new to me, and but again, let's start again. Thank you, Nick, for letting me be here as a writer for the Ennis News. And I'm always been intrigued regarding the investigative journalism of history and UFOs and past regarding government secrecy. And of course, your work with the Ministry of Defense and your public knowledge about UFOs, and then of course knowledge about incidents regarding Roswell, the Aurora crash, the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, Project MK Ultra and Blue Book, and the legacy of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, and then of course your roles regarding being a contributor with the Daily Mail and then the History Channel. We're going to discuss those events and also for future disclosure regarding UFOs and what might happen next in the near future. Nick, before we begin with the Aurora crash, please tell us about yourself and how did you get in UFOs and how did you get with the Ministry of Defense in Great Britain?
Well, sure. I was a civilian employee with the British Ministry of Defence, which is the
Right.
UK's equivalent of the DoD. And I
Mhm.
worked there for 21 years. You do a number of different postings, they move you around, so you get a lot of experience in different parts of the organization. And in 1991, it was just a case of right place, right time. I was due for a move. This particular vacancy became available on the UFO desk, and I was asked if I wanted to do 3 years or so of that as my next posting. So I accepted. I had no previous interest in this subject, no particular knowledge, no strong beliefs either way. I just went in. This was my government job, and I did that for the next 3 years. Moved on, but felt that it was too interesting and important to turn my back on, and particularly when the British government started to declassify and release a lot of the Ministry of Defence UFO files and documents, many of which I'd written, of course.
Mhm.
I increasingly played a public role in this as a sort of spokesperson, as somebody who now really has the job of, I guess, being a communicator in this field,
Right.
using
Right.
hopefully my background and give people some insider insights.
Wow. And sometimes people, I don't know if heard that they call you like the Mulder of your time during, you're at Great Britain and working for the Ministry of Defense. And is there whenever your time during your tenure, was there any intriguing UFO stories that you could share before we begin with the Aurora crash?
Sure, I mean lots. We got two or three hundred
Yeah.
reports each year.
Wow.
And
Yes.
although most of those, of course, turned out to have conventional explanations, after investigation,
Mm.
a lot of satellites, meteors,
Interesting.
re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, rocket debris, that sort of thing. Um, we had some fascinating cases. Around 5%, even after detailed investigation, we had no real explanation for. I remember one case from March 1993 where we had a wave of sightings uh, over a period of about 6 hours all across the UK. Lots of police and military witnesses. Um, one
Right.
scout leader was out leading a kind of group of scouts on a
Mm.
hike and saw what he described as being like almost like two Concorde supersonic aircraft stuck
Wow.
together.
Wow. It's
Uh,
amazing. Yes.
then we had one Air Force base that was directly overflown by this object. Then we had another, again, Air Force base, and the meteorological officer described a large triangular shaped craft moving very slowly, maybe 30,
Mm.
40 miles an hour, narrow beam of light firing down at the ground, tracking backwards and forwards as if it was looking for something. Low frequency humming sound coming from this craft. He said there was an unpleasant sound that you could feel reverberating through your body as well as here. And then suddenly, from this very low speed, it accelerated away to the horizon in just a second or two. So high max speeds, but with no sonic boom.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. I know you cherish your time, and I know that out there started what you do right now is to educate the public and making sure that we know about UFO incidents and how to get people interest. And I really appreciate what you do on that end. Uh, let's go on and let's get this ball rolling. Let's start with the Aurora crash of 1897. Nick, could you give us a brief overview of the case and your thoughts on the incident that happened in 1897, right before, I would say this is like one of the major events, UFO stories before Roswell. Can we begin with that incident before we go into Roswell?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the important thing here is that we're
Mhm.
50 years
Right.
before Roswell. And
Mhm.
of course, words, phrases like flying saucer and UFO simply don't exist. So people talked about this in terms of being, mystery airship, for
Mhm.
example. And the essential story was that this thing crashed in 1897, Aurora, Texas.
Right.
And there was apparently a sort of smallish entity,
Mhm.
humanoid but not human, who was the pilot and was killed on impact and or shortly after, and then buried in the local area with a
Right.
grave marker and such like. Now, I mean, it's very difficult to evaluate a story like this so long after the event with none of the primary witnesses still with us. And it's, they always say that once the last living witness of anything passes, then the story, as it were, transitions from living memory into history and legend even. And some people say this is the world's first UFO crash. Other people say no, this was a hoax. The railroad had passed Aurora by, and the town, wanted to do something to generate
Right.
a bit of interest and tourism and things, and came up with this story. We'll likely never know, short of actually digging up and locating a body and then subjecting it to forensic analysis and such like, we won't know.
Do you believe, I know we have these organizations, you're very familiar with MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and they believe, that's where I'm going to start asking question right now is regarding the government cover up. Do you believe this is could very well be a government cover up, or do you believe we need that's a circumstantial evidence, or do we need hard evidence, even though we have the belief that the government came in there in Aurora and of course, respecting the MUFON, they believe that they buried the alien in the cemetery, and then they had the gravestone, and then all of a sudden they just disappeared. So, what is your thoughts on about the government and potentially, one of the first cover ups before we get into Roswell?
Sure. I mean, obviously, the idea of there being a government UFO cover up is it's almost inextricably linked to
Right.
the wider narrative about UFOs.
Mhm.
And certainly a lot of the UFO community believe that right at the outset, whether the outset was Aurora or Roswell or something else, the government would have stepped in and taken possession of the body, maybe kind of muddied the waters a bit to cover their tracks, lead people down false trails. I mean, that's what government does. On the other hand, playing devil's advocate with this sort of stuff, show me the beef.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
yeah, I mean, it is very, very difficult with something like this, and
Mhm.
many, many times I've seen this firsthand. What looks like conspiracy and things
Right.
is 9 times out of 10 more likely to just be bureaucracy or just people telling a story which gets distorted over time and somebody turns up, starts poking around in the graveyard, and next person that hears that story gets a slightly different version of it until it ends up with the men in black came and
Right.
possession of all this and silenced the witnesses. So it's very, very difficult. The further back in time you go, I mean, any cop will tell you, you need to solve something like this, any case, criminal case, in the
Mhm.
first 48 hours. So you and I having a conversation now, uh, you know,
Mhm.
like decades after the event. I mean, it's really a stretch that we would get to anything other than this is an intriguing story. There's an
Right.
old joke in the
Right.
intelligence analysis community, interesting if true. That's kind of all I can really say about Aurora, Texas.
Wow. And then, because we have the newspapers documentation, we have, like I said, Jim Mars. I think you probably heard of Jim Mars. He's a investigative journalist for the Dallas Morning or Full Star Telegram back in the day. Whenever he interviewed these guys, and like I said, we have circumstantial evidence, we have a newspaper documentation, but the hard evidence, that's what we need. That's what we need to look for. And then, like I said, that's been years ago. And as we go into more of these UFO sightings and events, that's where the key evidence is, making sure we have that hard evidence. And it's one thing to listen to the key witness, but we'll make sure we need that hard evidence. And it's very, very interesting on that part.
Sure.
And,
I,
and of
I mean,
course,
I'll
and of
make one
course, right.
point.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'll make one other point in defense of this case.
Mhm.
Firstly, I knew Jim Mars quite well, and he was
Right.
he was certainly a real old-fashioned boots on the ground
Mhm.
investigative journalist. So I have to respect the fact that he looked into this in far more detail than I ever did, and he
Mhm.
was certainly convinced by this. And the other point I think it's worth making is that even in this era of, say, DNA evidence, forensics, surveillance, photography, and all of that, eyewitness testimony still lies at the heart of the criminal justice system. So although I say, where's the beef?
Mhm.
I do argue the other side and say, no, I respect the fact that eyewitness testimony and people telling a story, whether it's to an investigative journalist like Jim Mars or whether it's to journalists at the time, those people were there, I weren't, and eyewitness testimony is evidence.
Oh, you're right. And also remember, for people who audience that doesn't know, this is years, well, I mean, a couple years before the Wright brothers. And that's very interesting too. The Wright brothers, I believe it was in 1903 or 19, Kitty Hawk. That was the first we ever had in flight, the first in flight. So this is right before, the Wright brothers in a guarding airplane. So it's very interesting that we have this first UFO, like the Texas Roswell, they would say right before the Wright brothers. So it's very interesting in that. Moving on to the Roswell, and that's basically Roswell. Nick is, I would say, is of course, it's the grandfather story of UFOs, and it's the one that everybody knows about, and of course, people. See, I know where Roswell is. That's over in Arizona because they get mixed up with Area 51. Like, no, Roswell's in
Well,
New Mexico.
sorry, yeah, Roswell, New Mexico. Yeah.
Right, yeah, New Mexico. So for going to Roswell, uh, this starts out, is it July 7th, 1947? Is that when it actually started, or go ahead and with that one?
Yeah, there's a little dispute about when the crash actually was, because of course
Mhm.
by the time the local rancher told the sheriff, and then the sheriff told the military, and then the story got out to the Roswell Daily Record.
Right.
Some days had passed, so we'll likely never know the exact date of the crash. But yes, this is literally and metaphorically a ground zero for the whole modern UFO
Mhm.
phenomenon. And the most interesting piece of evidence, to my mind, about this is kind of twofold. Firstly, it's the fact that people have maybe a mistaken idea now that somehow the local newspaper got hold of the story, or the UFO community got it out. There was no UFO community in
Right, right.
1947,
Mhm.
Um, and what actually happened was the public relations officer, the base information officer at Roswell Army Airfield, Walter Haut,
Mhm.
actually caused the press release to be put out to Associated Press, and it got into for the Roswell Daily Record, but also then the story went around the world. But the point being, it was the military that caused this story to be put out. And a few weeks earlier, a light aircraft pilot called Kenneth Arnold had seen 9 objects which he described as
Wow,
moving like a saucer would if you skipped it across the water, and
amazing.
hence flying saucers.
Mhm.
And so when this story hit about Roswell, the story that the military caused to be put out was, hey, look, we, the military, in conjunction with the good officers of the local sheriff, have recovered one of these so-called flying discs, flying saucers, because flying saucer fever had been sweeping the United States and parts of the rest of the world for the couple of weeks since Kenneth Arnold's sighting. So the military put this story out. We've recovered a flying disc. Then within 24 hours, they changed their story and said it was just a weather balloon. Now, the point about that is the 509th Bomb Group, which was based at Roswell Army Airfield at the
Mhm.
time, and who were the people involved in the recovery. This was the only atomic bomb capable squadron anywhere in the world at the
Wow,
time. So this was
amazing.
arguably the most elite military units, not just the pilots, the intelligence officers, the administrators, the chain of command. If ever there was any group of people less likely to mistake a weather balloon, even if it was a weather balloon engaged on classified work, as has been alleged by skeptics,
Mhm.
a weather balloon is still a weather balloon.
Right, right. I
Ever
understand.
there's
Right.
Yeah. So
Yes. Oh,
if
yeah.
ever there's anyone less likely to mistake a weather balloon for a flying disc, it's
Mhm.
these guys in the 509th. They were the
Right.
best of the best.
And Jesse Marcel was a part of that 509 bomb group. And uh, so you have Mac Brazel, who saw this at his ranch. And then, of course, he took it to Roswell's, the I guess the sheriff. And I guess the sheriff called, I believe I believe it was General Blanchard, right?
Yeah, General Blanchard was involved.
Right.
Later
Mhm.
on, General Roger Ramey
Ramey,
was
right.
involved as this went up the chain of command.
Mhm. Yeah. So, and of course, it's interesting because you know Jesse Marcel's son is no longer here, but if you've seen the videos of his interviews, it's very interesting that what he was saying, that he had these hieroglyphics in the room whenever Jesse Marcel, his dad, brought that's very interesting. And these hieroglyphics, do we know what this could very well be from? I guess the alien uh, uh, from like origin, or is that what we're still trying to study? Where are these hieroglyphics? What does it mean? Or
Yeah,
can you
we
go more? Yeah,
yeah, we don't know. There were strange markings
yeah,
on this. I mean, skeptics say it was just a whole bunch of balsa wood and maybe a bit
right.
of metal and some patterns on it.
Mhm.
Believers in the UFO community say that this was hieroglyphics. If they're right, there's no way that we could translate this because, of course, we have no Rosetta Stone, for want of a better
Right.
phrase. I mean, we only decoded the Egyptian hieroglyphs because we had the Rosetta Stone, which because we knew what it said in, I think, Greek and Roman, we could then translate it. But no, I mean, it's guesswork. Anyone who says they can translate alien hieroglyphs is kidding themselves.
Wow. Well, that's very amazing. And of course, Don Schmidt, one of your colleagues out there in the world, he is probably in your, I mean, and because you can correct me if I'm wrong, he's probably he was there with Dr. J. Allen Hynek from the beginning, and he kind of investigated Roswell, and his kind of like being the Jim Mars, his interviews with everybody involved with Roswell is really fascinating. What Don Schmidt has done on that part, and it's one of those things where we have the hard evidence regarding the debris, but then again it kind of disappeared, right, because of government coming in, and then they just took it all, right.
Yes, Don Schmidt's done a fantastic job
Right.
in tracking down, interviewing, and then placing into the public domain a lot of the raw data, his boots on the ground interviews
Mhm.
with some of the contemporary people, and of course with their families, who were very often the only people these first-hand witnesses shared their stories with.
Wow, that's amazing, Nick. uh, and of course we're still gonna of course continue with till this day, researching and Roswell and all these great UFOs from the past, and the story still continues to be here today. Moving on to of course we're to I guess Area 51 before we get into Betty Barney Hill abductions. Before we get into that, so Area 51, of course, is in Arizona or Nevada, right outside in Nevada. And Nick, so give us an overview about Area 51. And is this like an undisclosed location for the military, or is this actually like a military base regarding Area 51?
Well, Area 51 exists.
Right.
It was undisclosed for many, many years.
Hmm.
Um, but in comparatively recent times, they finally officially disclosed what, of course, investigative journalists, the UFO community, conspiracy theory researchers had known for years and years, that this facility exists. It's part of Nellis Air Force Base. It's
Right.
hundreds of square miles. And officially, the
Mhm.
story is this is a remote, secure facility where the United States has developed and test flown, um, prototype spy planes, other aircraft, the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71
Wow.
Blackbird reconnaissance aircraft, F-117 stealth fighter, B-2 stealth bomber.
Mhm.
Sure, that's the official story. The unofficial story, as far as the UFO community is concerned, is that ultimately, perhaps first via Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and some other locations, but
Mhm.
ultimately that's where the Roswell debris was taken. And according to whistleblowers like Bob Lazar, of course,
Right.
this is where there is some sort of, maybe even joint human alien program, but certainly crashed UFOs are taken to Area 51. So the allegations go. And this is where the United States military and scientific community tries to reverse engineer this technology to figure out how it works and to build their own.
Right. Going back to Bob Lazar, for people who don't know, back in the 80s, I believe, Nick, he was interviewed, or he came out back in the 80s. I wasn't I wasn't around back in the 80s, but I believe, Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, he came out as a whistleblower, right? And he came out and said that they had like a recovered UFO craft, aircraft, or I mean craft, and Area 51, and he came out saying that they've had like alien bodies. Is that I'm assuming that's what he was saying too.
Yes, he said essentially that exactly that crash retrievals, reverse engineering,
Right.
alien bodies, maybe live aliens too.
Mhm.
Bob Lazar, of course, very controversial figure, but it was
Right.
investigative journalist, Las Vegas-based investigative journalist George Knapp, who
George Knapp.
broke that story in 1989. More recently, his protege, a filmmaker called Jeremy Corbell, has
Mhm.
made a film on Bob Lazar and reintroduced a new generation of people to that testimony. And of course, with all the recent revelations about ATIP and US Navy videos and US government programs looking at all this, a lot of people have kind of rediscovered or reevaluated the Bob Lazar story and have said, well, maybe there was something to this after all.
Right. And he claimed he went to Harvard or MIT or one of those universities. And of course, I remember, of course, Stanton Friedman, one of UFO colleagues out there. He's no longer here. But it's interesting. He one of the controversies or one of those shadows of Bob Lazar, where we don't know if he's telling the truth or not. I'm not saying Bob Lazar isn't telling the truth, but of course, Stanton Friedman said that he contacted, I believe it was MIT or Harvard, where supposedly he graduated, and he never went there. And so that's one of those things very interesting about regarding what Stanton Friedman was referring to about
Yes.
his, yeah,
Now, Stanton Friedman, of course, was
yeah,
a real believer.
right,
So
right,
he would have wanted to
right,
have
make sure,
believed
right,
Bob
right,
Lazar. So it's
right,
actually one of the arguments against Bob
mhm,
Lazar's story
right,
that a true believer like Stanton, who would have loved this to have been
mhm.
true,
Oh yeah, right,
um, was not able to find any evidence that it was, or rather, as you say, he having contacted MIT,
right,
the professors there know they'd never heard of Bob Lazar. So the point, Stanton Friedman's point was, well, if he's lied about his background,
mhm.
um, how can we take his other claims
Seriously,
more
right,
seriously? Now,
right,
conspiracy theorists might say, well, maybe they kind of altered the records and had a word in the ear of the professors, and they were all in on it. But I mean, really, making someone disappear from the yearbooks, including the hard copies,
right,
none of his contemporaries remember him. So that is problematic for sure.
right. And of course, it's that's one of those things that I was, whenever I was much smaller, I had an opportunity to meet Stanton Freeman and Roswell at the UFO convention a long time ago. And Stanton Freeman was a phenomenal person, and he will be, of course, in the UFO community's hearts, and everybody else that knows journalism and wants to continue to make sure we get to the bottom of the truth regarding UFOs. And moving on from Area 51 and of course Bob Lazar, one of the most intriguing abduction cases going into abduction cases. First of all, we're going to talk about the Betty and Barney Hill, and of course, also in Travis Walton. But starting out with Betty and Barney Hill abduction, Nick, tell us about the overview and background regarding that and the significance, and then we can continue with our discussion. That
Sure. I mean, Betty and Barney Hill, this is September 1961.
Mhm.
They are returning home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire,
Right.
after, visiting the White Mountains, driving through. They see a UFO,
Mhm.
and then they kind of have a sense of disorientation. They get back home
Mhm.
and they find that this journey, which they're very familiar with, and they know exactly how long this journey should take, has taken them considerably longer. They have a period of so-called missing time,
Right.
and then they begin to have a series of disturbing dreams and flashbacks to illustrate or to suggest to them that their UFO encounter might have been rather more detailed and lengthy than just a sighting of lights in the sky. And then they undergo regression hypnosis with a very highly respected, um, you
Mhm.
know, Dr. Benjamin Simon,
Right.
psychotherapist. Um, Now, regression hypnosis is controversial. Some people
Mhm.
say that it can distort memories and maybe introduce false memories, but this guy was at the top of his game, internationally respected. And under this regression hypnosis came out the story that this UFO actually landed, and they were forcibly taken onto the craft. There were some interactions. They were shown a star map, or Betty glimpsed a star map. We can get into that, but
Mhm.
and so this was really the first. It's not necessarily the world's first alien abduction, but it was
Mhm.
first, certainly the first one to have emerged in the United States, the first one to really become a widely known story. And
Mm.
the interesting thing about Betty and Barney is that this is way back in 1961, before the Civil Rights Act. They were a mixed race couple, and a
Right,
mixed race
interracial.
couple
Right.
in New Hampshire, which was
Mm.
very white
Mm.
at the time. So this was unusual. They were both active in the civil rights movement,
Mhm.
and of course passionate about that. The last thing they wanted was anything that would have, I don't know, brought them into disrepute. And yet they felt so strongly about this story being a real experience that they still decided to speak out.
Right. And going back to, and I think that's what, before we go into, the star map and everything, that particular situation, you're right. This was right before the Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia, that legalized interracial marriage. So it's very interesting, like you said, you know, it was, especially during right before the heart of the civil rights movement, you have this interracial couple, and I don't, I mean, I'm just saying, I'm a, historical person. I have a degree in history, and studying all that. It's interesting in the United States, 1961, interracial couple. It's like, well, who are they gonna believe? People are feel like they're not gonna believe because they're interracial. And it's very not, saying it's New Hampshire, and it's very white predominantly population, but it's very interesting uh, that that happened, and right before the Supreme Court case. But other, besides that, the point, it's very interesting because of that. And going back to the missing time, it's interesting. Whenever I believe they said they were driving down the car, and next thing you know, they look at their watches and they're like, they feel like they missed a time. The missing time is very interesting, and going back to the hypnosis, and you said whether if that's you know medically, you know uh, regarding like if it's a legit thing to do. That's very interesting. And like I said, having the dreams, I bet that's, being having those dreams is very scary. And of course, I believe it was, is it during the hypnosis or coming into an interview where I believe it was Betty who said that I guess one of supposedly these aliens said that they came from the planet Zeta Reticuli. Was that what she said? Or
Well, what happened was that
yeah.
she saw what she assumed was, and what they told her was basically a star
Star
map
map. Right.
showing Earth, and showing what you could almost describe as like trade routes or highways
Right.
between nearby stars. And she didn't know Zeta Reticuli. And
Hmm.
so then what happened was that Betty Hill sketched this star map
Hmm.
from memory. And then an amateur astronomer called Marjorie Fish got hold of this, and she worked through all the permutations of nearby stars and how they might appear if viewed on a two-dimensional map. And she came to the conclusion that the sort of central hub of this map, where
Wow.
the aliens came from, their homeworld, was Zeta 2 Reticuli. And
Hmm.
what we now know is that Zeta 2 Reticuli is very close in galactic terms. It's about 39 light years from Earth. So it will be very interesting to see whether James Webb Space Telescope and the next generation of telescopes find any evidence of a biosignature, a technosignature coming from this particular area. Because if that's
Fascinating.
true, that would be a very interesting validation of what Betty and Barney Hill could not have known in 1961.
Wow, that is very fascinating. And Nick, also the stained dress. What's the significance behind the stained dress in that particular situation?
Well, Betty,
Yeah.
but I mean, I met Betty.
Right.
in I think 1999 actually,
Hmm.
and she was a very feisty individual, and
Hmm.
she, as she put it to me, not mincing words, she said when they grabbed a hold of me and tried to drag me onto the ship, she said I got into a fist fight basically,
Wow. Wow.
and in all of this, her dress was sort of touched
Uh-huh.
and and so nowadays, of course, if an investigator was kind of trying to investigate that, that would be forensicated, and clearly, if this had been touched by an extraterrestrial, you would expect there to be some sort of residue that modern forensic techniques could determine. Now, of course, over the years, I don't know whether this dress still exists. I think Betty's niece, Kathleen Martin, is custodian of Betty's estate. I can't recall whether she has this dress, but even if she
Hmm.
does, of course, it's been handled by so many people over the years that I doubt there's anything that could be done. But again, it makes you think if something like this happened nowadays, you'd get it straight to a laboratory and you get it tested.
Wow, that's very fascinating, and I'm sure it was very fascinating for you to meet Betty. That was very neat. And also moving on to so go from Betty and Barney Hill to the '60s, and now we're moving on to Arizona into the '70s, and a logger by the name of Travis Walton, uh, and uh, and he believed that it's with his buddies. He's a logger, and I believe Nick. Uh, he saw this bright light, and they were going forwarded, and I guess what happened, Nick? So the bright light, did it like beam off of him, or and then of course
Yeah.
they left him, or they what did his friends do on that situation?
Well, he was in
Right,
a he was part in a
mhm,
party of
right,
7 loggers
right,
working a particular patch of forest near
mhm,
Snowflake, Arizona.
right,
This is 1975.
mhm,
And they see this UFO. And Travis, I think he's the youngest of the 7, and a
right,
real kind of, I don't know
rough.
how
Oh
you
yeah,
describe him, but a
uh,
kind of, probably a sort of fairly hard
oh yeah,
living, you
rough
know,
person. Yeah,
so he gets out and he's like
mhm,
he's wanting to kind of get a closer look, and the rest of them are screaming at him to get back in the truck. And then as he approaches, the story is that he's struck by a beam of light from this UFO, and he
right,
goes flying through the air, and he's kind of, flat out, and the rest of the guys think he's dead, and they, of course, are kind of fearful of their own situation. They drive off, and then they get to a certain point, and then the leader, the foreman of the group, basically says, "No, no, we can't leave him, guys. We got to go back." And they go back, and he's gone. And so, they report this to the local sheriff, and they're kind of subjected to the third degree. And the local cops kind of have a theory. They think that maybe by accident or by design, but they killed Travis, and this is maybe a story to I don't know, cover the tracks. So
mhm,
now, of course, skeptics say, well, this is a complete hoax. I tell you, if I was being grilled by the local cops and suddenly the prospect of a murder charge
oh,
comes comes onto the
yeah,
table, I think that's the point where I might say to myself, you know what, we've pushed too far here. We'd better just fess up. And but they didn't do that. They doubled down, and he stayed missing for 5 days.
5 days. Wow.
5 days. And then 5 days later, he turns up disorientated, confused in another local town. He calls and he says, can someone come and get me? And his story is that after he was hit by the beam, he was taken onto the craft, and he now believes that they kind of saved his life, some sort of procedure.
Interesting.
They accidentally hurt him with the beam, and then that they had to kind of fix him again. And you know, I've met Travis
Mm.
many times over the years. Every time I talk to him, you know, this is a tough guy.
Right.
Um, but you see in his eyes what I can really only describe as like what you see in the eyes of somebody who's got post-traumatic stress disorder from maybe serving in Iraq or Afghanistan. And this guy, you know, decades afterwards, he sticks to his story. It's like, you know, no, this is what happened. Um, and so yeah, it's a fascinating story for sure.
And they made a movie about him called Fire in the Sky. That's very interesting. I know, of
Yes.
course, right. That's very interesting too.
He said they took a lot of poetic license, particularly with what happened on the ship
Wow.
and things. But he said that in the build up to the movie and with some of the stuff with the other loggers being grilled by the local cops, he said that part was pretty accurate. But he said Hollywood couldn't resist being Hollywood for the bit with the aliens.
Wow. That's very, very fascinating. Because I believe it like in the trailer and I've seen the movie too, where he's always screaming, and of course anybody who, I mean, be abducted by an alien, that would be scare like hell. I
Yeah, but
mean,
again,
that's just crazy. Yeah,
Travis being Travis, I think he fought back and he probably got a
right.
few licks in.
Wow, yeah, wow, that's very, very fascinating. Uh, very, very fascinating. Uh, yeah, and going on to shifting to uh, Dr. J. Allen Hynek. I believe he was a professor, Nick, at Ohio State University, and he, of course, got into the close encounters. And I believe there was three, right? The first encounters of the first kind, second, and then the third kind. Nick, tell me about J. Allen Hynek and his legacy behind Project Blue Book.
Sure. Well, J. Allen Hynek, as you say,
Mm.
astronomy professor, and he was asked to come on board with Project Blue Book, which was
Right.
the US Air Force's investigation program into UFOs.
Mm.
And he came on basically as the scientific advisor. And so when he started this, and actually he'd had involvement in the programs that preceded Blue Book. I mean, essentially the same kind of strategic mission, but different project names. They had Sign, Grudge, and Blue Book. So
Mm.
he'd always been involved with this. He also worked with Jacques Vallée, who's another very important figure in the UFO community. One of the first people, for example, to realize the importance of computers
Mm.
in recording data about UFO cases. But Hynek was, as the astronomy professor, he was the scientific advisor. He was always trying to inject sort of proper scientific methodology into the Air Force's investigations. And
Right.
he, ironically, to start with, of course, he had a reputation as a debunker because very often he found conventional explanations. And sometimes he put explanations which were probably a bit of a stretch. So, for example, in 1967, the famous wave of sightings in Michigan,
Mm.
he came up with the explanation of swamp gas, and it
Swamp
became
gas.
almost a like cliche for what debunkers do is to take almost any testimony, however, you know, whatever the description is, and just say, oh, it's swamp gas.
Mm.
But eventually, he kind of transitioned from this debunker to someone who was like, well, wait a minute, there's no smoke without fire. Some of these cases are genuinely anomalous. And yet the Air Force seems to want to just sweep them under the carpet. All they want to do is close the case. So he on one particular occasion, I think it was a local cop who'd seen a landed UFO, the Lonnie Zamora case. On
Mm.
one, he got so frustrated that he exclaimed in frustration, "The Air Force doesn't understand, doesn't know what science is." And he was their scientific advisor.
Right.
So that was a
Right.
fairly damning indictment
Wow.
of the Air Force. Now, the Air Force got out of investigating UFOs at the end of the 60s, but Hynek was a real gamekeeper turned poacher, and he felt this was too important to stop doing, and so he essentially started a private group, the Center for UFO Studies, which after his death was renamed in his honor the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies, not as well known as MUFON, but again, trying to continue his scientific legacy. So if you ask me what is J. Allen Hynek's legacy, I would say scientific ufology. So the sort of thing that Professor Avi Loeb at Harvard, who runs the Galileo project, is trying to do. In other words, look at UFOs, but through the lens of science and data. That was what J. Allen Hynek was doing, and it's what a sort of thought leader like Avi Loeb is doing now.
Right, and he is the innovator regarding scientific data regarding UFOs because
Yes.
he is.
And
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier, sorry to interrupt, but you
Yeah.
mentioned, and yeah, I should just say one of the things that he is best known for is
Mhm.
this series of categorization of
Right.
UFO sightings. So a close encounter of the first kind is essentially where someone sees a craft. A close encounter of the second kind is something where the craft has some sort of effect on the environment. It might be that it's detected on radar. It might be that it lands and there are burn marks, scorch marks, or indentations on the ground. It might be that it stops a car engine and that there's a possible electromagnetic field. And a close encounter of the third kind is where somebody sees entities in association with this. So, of course, Steven Spielberg got a hold of this,
Mhm.
brought Alan Hynek on as an advisor to the
Wow.
movie, and in fact, interesting piece of film trivia, gave him a cameo role in the film. And if you
Interesting.
look carefully at the sequence where the mothership is coming down, J. Allen Hynek is the guy with the pipe.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I did not know that. That's interesting. That's very cool and very neat to know that. And uh, that tells you that Steven Spielberg had was very thoughtful and knew that this guy was the top person regarding UFOs because making a movie about the close encounters and especially the close encounter of the third kind and bringing in Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who's a very respectable person, is really a true honor for him to do that. Of course, one of my questions is Nick is whenever you had J. Allen Hynek starting as being a skeptic first, you didn't but and then of course investigating UFOs. Do you believe that right there shows you that uh, an ordinary person that doesn't believe in the UFOs, doesn't believe any alien life form out there, that like Dalen Hynek, investigating and getting to know that there is something out there that's very. I can tell you right there that there is the evidence regarding from Dalen Hynek that you go from being a skeptic to being a believer in the UFOs. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. When somebody
Mhm.
who's smart and open-minded, like
Right.
Heine, actually looks at the data, gets his
Mhm.
boots on the ground, does the research and investigation, and comes to the conclusion that while most of these things can be explained in conventional terms as misidentifications, hoaxes, or delusions, some can't, then that should tell us
Right.
something.
Right. And of course, Don Schmidt. Remember Don Schmidt saying that he wasn't a believer. He didn't. He was a skeptic himself. And of course, getting involved in Roswell and I believe Nick. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe Don Schmidt was actually helping with Jalen Hynek back in the day. But that's very interesting itself, right there.
Yes, yes. When Hynek was at the center or founded the Center for
Right.
UFO Studies, I
Right.
know Don Schmidt. I think worked directly as a personal assistant on some cases and was deeply involved with that. So yeah,
Wow. Going from Project Blue Book, and then of course, courts going into the government secrecy or government, or the I say, investigating, guard UFOs, and then going into the MK Ultra, where they do all this scientific experiments on, I believe it was in the military, right? So how is there like a UFO correlation with MK Ultra and Blue Book, or regarding the UFOs, regarding how you do scientific experiments on, I guess, I would say citizens, but also, of course, in the military, correlation.
I think the read across is that
Yeah.
verifiably the government, the military, and the intelligence community in the United States has often looked at things that the public and the media might say is the weird stuff, like
Right.
UFOs, but also so-called remote viewing, which really came out of a concern that the Soviet Union was investing a lot in telekinesis.
Mhm.
And just as you didn't want a missile gap, you didn't want a psychic gap. So the US government got into seeing if they could recruit psychics, see if those psychics could then locate targets of interest to the intelligence community, like missile silos, that sort of thing. Um, uh, and then MK Ultra was really born out of this, and for want of a better phrase, was almost like literally mind control. Can we, through, for example, drugs like
Mhm.
LSD, or psychic abilities, because remote influencing is the flip side of remote viewing, and can we do something with this? So that's, I guess, the connection, that it's what you might call a low probability, high impact project. Even if you're skeptical about it, the consequences, if you can get any of this to work, are so huge that you need to be in the game.
Mhm.
And of course, this led to some abuses and the death of at least one scientist involved with the program, and who jumped out of a window. Of course, some people say he was murdered, but and
Wow.
then the church committee got involved in trying to regulate some of this, and it got kind of bogged down in controversies about abuses of the system by the CIA and other other parts of the military and the intelligence community. But MK Ultra existed, and the government, and we saw this, of course. This is slightly off topic, but
Mhm.
related with the syphilis studies. We know that people were deliberately infected.
Right.
This was a different era, and basic human rights that we would maybe take for granted now were just trampled on, or weren't even a thing. And so there were abuses, and people could get away with things back in those days, the 50s and the 60s, that you would never, hopefully, be able to get away with now.
Wow. And and MK Ultra, I believe, you have the government, doing all those experiments and things, and it's very interesting because I guess regarding the UFO, believers, or the UFO community, is there I guess, the correlation, or is this where how they do experiments on aliens? Is there like a similarity between these two, or
I
regarding?
don't think it's a yeah, I don't think
Yeah.
it's a direct read
Right.
across. I think it's
Yeah.
the idea that the government does look at the weird stuff. And it's
Right.
also the idea that a lot of this is kept from the media and the public, and even
Right.
from congressional oversight, by
Mhm.
what nowadays we would probably call deep state
Right.
gatekeepers.
Mhm. Right. That's very interesting. Nick, moving on. Of course, you mentioned uh, to me about the article where you cautioned some researchers are falling down a paranormal rabbit hole, from Daily Mail article, focusing on fringe or unverified claims at the expense of hard data. Do you think that the current disclosure movement risks losing credibility by blending serious testimony with overly speculative or supernatural ideas?
I think there is a danger.
Okay.
In the last few years, the subject of UFOs has transitioned out of the fringe and into the mainstream, and we've gotten the attention of Congress in a way that's never really happened before. Um, there have been some previous congressional hearings, but nothing on the scale of what we have now, with interest from the Senate and the House, interest from the intelligence committees, the armed services committees, the oversight committees. It's bipartisan, which is great. There have been classified briefings, there have been public hearings, there have been UFO related provisions in each of the National Defense Authorization Acts for the last few years now. And the reason that's happened is that we've managed to rebrand the subject of UFOs, or UAP as it's called in government.
Right.
We've ditched the kind of pop culture baggage of this being seen as a part science fiction, part conspiracy theory.
Mhm.
And it's the conversation has been framed in terms of defense, national security, and safety of flight. And that's exactly how you get the attention of Congress. Now, if you suddenly start injecting a lot of paranormal talk, a lot of spiritual talk into this, you're going to lose that. And obviously, I'm not disparaging people's religious beliefs, but
Mhm.
I tend to believe that those should be private things.
Right.
and
Right. Right.
and having gotten Congress interested in UAP, as this is something that our pilots see. They're tracked on radar. They are detected on multiple sensor platforms like electro-optical, forward-looking infrared, um, weapon seeker,
Mm-hmm.
satellites. If you start suddenly talking about spirituality and telepathy, you're going to lose that
Most
congressional
people. Right.
audience,
Mhm.
because people in Congress who are very happy to say, look, something's in our airspace. It's tracked on radar, seen on satellite. We need to figure out, is this China? Is this Russia? Is it something else? Those people are going to disengage if suddenly, for want of a better phrase, you start injecting a lot of woo into the conversation, and talking about the Galactic Federation and
Right.
all of that.
Star
So
Wars.
yeah,
Yeah.
so my plea to the UFO community is, look, let's play the strongest hand here. And if you want Congress to stay engaged, keep pushing the national security and safety of flight aspects of this. Let's look at the satellite data. Let's see what the radar tapes can tell us. Let's not go down the paranormal rabbit hole. So that was my warning. And I sent out a tweet to that effect. And the Daily Mail, which is a national newspaper in the United Kingdom, picked
Mhm.
up that story and ran with it. And I'm glad they did, because I think it's an important conversation to have.
Right. And that goes back to what I was saying, how can researchers and journalists draw the line between credible investigation and harmful speculation?
Yeah. And the answer to that, I think, is it's simple. It's how a journalist, or how anyone, like a
Right.
student at university, evaluates any information. You have to use critical thinking. I
Right.
mean, teachers and professors and parents, particularly in this era of the internet and AI in particular, should be teaching people from a very early age discernment. Identify good sources of information and then cite those sources.
Right. And of course, you know, being a danger that sensationalism could draw out real breakthroughs or undermine the public trust, like we were talking about earlier about intergalactic, whatever you're, how
Yeah.
blue or whatever, yeah,
Look,
that can determine what people are, they just like whatever their minds are going to whichever direction.
yeah. I mean, maybe, look,
Yeah,
I'm a
yeah,
firm believer that there's
yeah,
life out there in the universe. I'm
right,
open-minded about
all right,
extraterrestrial visitation.
right, yeah,
Maybe there is a galactic federation, but people like Marco Rubio aren't going to stay in the conversation
all
if
right,
some
yeah,
people start talking to them about galactic federation.
mhm,
But they'll stay in the conversation if you start, continue the conversation about F-18 pilots chasing these things and filming them on forward-looking infrared camera.
right. Yeah, absolutely, and that goes back to a couple years ago, individual named of David Grush or Grush or one of those whistleblowers. Uh, how do you see his credibility regarding identifying flying objects in the military? Do you believe he's credible, or these whistleblowers that's come out fairly recently over the years? And I believe it was Tucker Carlson who interviewed you about these whistleblowers, and what is your take on their credibility?
Well, Tucker Carlson interviewed me when he
Right.
had his show, Tucker Carlson Tonight. I was a
Mhm.
regular contributor. I
Mhm.
think he interviewed me 13 or 14 times.
Mhm.
Uh, and on the whistleblowers, my uh, line on this is very straightforward. These people, I mean, the people who you've seen testify
Mhm.
in front of Congress, who you might call whistleblowers, people like Lou Elizondo
Mhm.
and David Grush. These people are who they say they are, and they did what they said they did. You do not get anywhere near testifying in public under oath to Congress without the staffers and then some of the congressional representatives themselves with the DOD, with the intelligence community, vetting the heck out of these
Mhm.
people.
Oh, right,
So
right, right.
they David Grush was a member of the intelligence community and was verifiably one of the representatives on the UAP task force when Jay Stratton was director. So when Dave Grush says, I went around and spoke to 35, 40 people on this, he doesn't mean in some internet chat room. He means in the government, the military, the
Mhm.
intelligence community.
Wow.
Now,
And right, and it goes back to uh, what kind of chain of custody would exist in such material? Would it be, I guess, from the top down, or because I believe that if you're coming out speaking, and especially going before Congress, the military, we've seen from the past regarding Roswell or government cover up. I mean, whenever these guys go out and speak, what they've seen or what they've heard, or it's like one of those, oh, I've seen it, touched it, feel it, you know and I bet these guys are very tough to go out there knowing what the government's going to say, or what people are going to say about that, what they believe.
yes, Dave Grush is very clear on this. He
Yeah.
said that as a result of his
Yeah.
inquiries in the intelligence community,
Mhm.
he has no doubt that there are indeed legacy intelligence community programs dealing with crash retrievals and reverse engineering. I guess the first question is that true? And we can get on to the fact that, of course, recently the Wall Street Journal has alleged that some of these are false narratives that may have been deliberately created to distract from Black Project tech. And it's possible that even people in the intelligence community may have been taken in by these false narratives. So that's one
Right.
question.
Mhm.
Are these narratives actually true? Then the next question is, if they are true, are these legacy programs, are they unacknowledged special access programs? Are they waived unacknowledged special access programs? Or are they illegal programs?
Right, and that's very interesting.
This is still,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
where Congress must now continue to do what it has done and try and work to verify these claims. Again, as I say, factoring in now the Wall Street Journal's allegation that some of these narratives were deliberately inserted into things like induction packs for new commanders, either, as I say, to distract from Black Project technology, or even as some sort of practical joke, a hazing almost, or as a loyalty test to see if someone would leak it. So Congress has got to look at that. And also, of course, we now have the newly formed task force on the declassification of federal secrets, headed up by Anna Paulina Luna. They're currently looking at the JFK assassination, but they've made it very clear that they're going to be looking at UAP and USOs. So they have got a lot of work to do.
Right, right, and that's what the job of Congress is doing, and that goes back exactly what you're talking about. We need to make sure that we are staying focused on the task at hand, not getting into this, you know, Hollywood, where they come up with the Star Wars type, where we call what's out there in outer space something that we want to make sure it's factual, scientific, and hard evidence, and not where people just come up with their own ideas and myths about what's out there out in outer space or regarding alien life form. Uh, so that goes back to my next question is, uh, are we at the tipping point for disclosure, or is this another cycle of hype and suppression regarding what's going on in Congress and on these evidence and regarding these whistleblowers?
Well,
Regarding, are we gonna maybe one day see a say an alien footage from the 1950s, or one day where we say that there is you know alien life form, or is that where Congress, they have to keep continuing to do that work?
Congress has to keep
Continue.
doing that work.
Right.
Um, Obviously, the question of disclosure
Hmm.
really turns on what there is to disclose. I mean, I know it
Right.
sounds obvious, but obviously you can only disclose if you are actually sitting on a smoking gun. And so while it's possible that these rumors are true and that there is a sort of smoking gun, crashed UFOs, uh, non-human intelligence bodies,
Mhm.
uh, it's equally possible that that's not true. But if it's not true, and even if there's no smoking gun, doesn't mean you couldn't have first contact tomorrow if Earth is being interacted with by extraterrestrials. So you could have disclosure, provided there's something to disclose, or you could have first contact. And in either event, clearly the societal impact would be immense. It would fundamentally change our world. Every aspect of our lives would be deeply and profoundly impacted, whether it's politics, religion, science, technology, or the economy.
Mhm.
And so I don't have a crystal ball. I mean, certainly I can say that the pace of revelations, the drumbeat, so to speak, seems to be picking up. But then you could see something like the Wall Street Journal article, and many people are characterizing it as almost like the Empire Strikes Back.
Right.
And so, yeah, I don't know. We have seen these sorts of peaks and troughs
Mhm.
before of interest and engagement, and then eventually it's like it peters out because there is no actual smoking gun. Well, like I say, maybe this time will be different, but maybe not, because ultimately this is an events-led scenario, and it's events, and particularly those events that come suddenly and unexpectedly from left field, that will determine how this ends up.
Right. And I guess that goes back to, after the Roswell incident, I believe it was like the 100th year anniversary, or wherever it was, I mean, 70th year, it was anniversary back in 97. and where the U.S. government had their final report, whether it was a weather balloon, it wasn't a UFO down crash in Roswell, New Mexico, and so I guess that's where it's interesting because you don't have where the government right now is having their final report on what these pilots have saw in the sky, or so it's very interesting that we don't have that right now. Whether okay, maybe even though they're telling the truth, but regarding what you're saying is we don't know how the crystal ball, but we don't know whether if there is actual hard evidence regarding the alien life form unless something happens, unless something where they all suddenly come down or whatever is right now. But
Yes.
that final report is really interesting regarding the Roswell because they said, oh, it was a test dummy. It wasn't a UFO. It wasn't alien bodies. It was a test dummy. It was a weather balloon. So that was interesting too. Yep.
Yes. Now that may or may not be correct,
Right.
and this theory of this Wall Street Journal article about
Mhm.
false narratives
Right.
may or may not be correct. I mean, of course, people look at the Wall Street Journal as if it's some sort of new revelation. Um, no, I mean,
Right. Right.
as far back as the 50s and the 60s, elements in the intelligence community were talking up the UFO possibilities to
Mhm.
hide the fact that some pilots had been seeing the U-2 and the SR-71 prototypes. So there's really often nothing new with these sorts of allegations. And even if this explains some cases and some false narratives, it doesn't explain all of them. And one of my favorite sayings in all of this is to point out that when it comes to UFOs, the skeptics have to be right every single time, but the believers only need to be right once.
Mm. Mm. It's very, very powerful statement. Yeah, very, very interesting. Of course, yeah, that is very, very interesting. And then, there's no telling because that was, I believe, Tucker Carlson, you were on his show for a very long, time, a couple years ago, whenever he's not on Fox News anymore. But all these revelations, all these game-changing moments we're seeing is very fascinating. And the article regarding the rabbit hole is very interesting too, because we need to make sure that we are staying on track and not going left field, right field, or whatever people are saying that it's some type of some star federation out there. So it's very interesting what you're saying, and hopefully we continue that course, and Nick, you engaging the public and regarding that we need to make sure that we do stay that course and not going into veering off to other parts of our wild imagination. So
Absolutely. Let's stay
yeah,
focused, but there's no smoke without fire, and
right,
clearly something's going on here. Why wouldn't we want to continue the quest to find out what's going on?
right. Nick, thank you so much for giving your insights about this. I appreciate you and what you do and what you have done in the past, and your being a member and also working in the Ministry of Defense for the United Kingdom and working at the UFO desk. Nick, is there any thoughts or anything that you would like to share, or anything that we would keep an eye out, make sure, I guess, you continue to read articles, reading regarding UFOs or anything day by day, or continuing, or is there any other thoughts regarding the Daily Mail or anything that would need to keep an eye out there in the near future?
No, I think I've covered everything in this conversation. I would say, though, that
Yeah,
the things to keep an eye on are the next congressional hearings, whenever
okay.
they're held, and particularly what the task force on the declassification of federal secrets does on this. That's the next thing to watch.
All right, Nick, thank you so much, and thank you for having this conversation. Thank you again.
Thanks. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye now.